You have to click on accept. It's not clear to me exactly what your experience of this is compared to mine, but I assume you do. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is share the screen of this text. Which is, you'll see already that the version that I put up here is different to the one, it's a different title, slightly different title to the one that I put into the course materials already. The work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction is this one, which is the older standard translation, but the more accurate translation is the one that we got. It's from 2010 reproduced. The work of art in the age of its, like the artworks, mechanical reproducibility. Why does that matter? Because mechanical reproducibility is more accurate, and Walter Benjamin is trying to be very precise. But this version that we can read, because it's the PDF that I could find, is from Illuminations, a book called Illuminations, a collection of his essays, and it was edited by Hannah Arendt. And that itself is significant, right? Hannah Arendt was a very important Jewish intellectual who was German and worked in Germany, and then in World War II, before World War II, just before, left Germany, and was one of the immigrant scholars that landed up in New York during World War II. And she taught at the New School for Social Research for many, many years. And well, in Germany previously, she had been the lover of Martin Heidegger, the philosopher. And that was kind of a big controversy because, of course, Heidegger in 1933 accepted the call, 1935, accepted the call from Hitler and became advocate of the Nazi regime inside the university. And after World War II, Heidegger was no longer allowed to teach, even though so many, including Hannah Arendt, thought that he was the greatest philosopher, but that he made this mistake of joining with the Nazis. So very interesting, and Hannah Arendt is the one who edits this volume of Walter Benjamin's work, because they were looking after bringing out Walter Benjamin's work, because he was the leading light, or one of the leading lights of the so-called Frankfurt School of social theory, social criticism. Frankfurt School is where Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, as leaders of that school, set up. And an important film theorist, Siegfried Kracauer, was a part of Frankfurt School. He was like the teacher of Adorno. And Walter Benjamin was Adorno's friend. And he was never really formally employed by the Frankfurt School. He was paid a stipend occasionally, and they tried desperately to get him out of Europe. But he lived in Paris rather than Frankfurt for a long time before World War II. And he lived on money they sent him and on writing he earned as a newspaper writer. Walter Benjamin, this is. Well, as a theatre critic, really. Now, he was writing his book, I have it up there, the Origins of, he was writing a PhD, Origins of Tragedy. But it wasn't really accepted by the university, so he never got a university job. So he made his money, made his livelihood through journalism, through writing for a newspaper as a theatre critic, and writing in what was called then a feuilleton. Feuilleton is a French, but used in German, a word for the magazine section of a newspaper where, I mean, this still happens in German newspapers, less so around the world. They have really serious intellectual debates inside the newspaper, and scholars would write these articles. Siegfried Kracauer, for example, was a sociologist from the Frankfurt School and an editor of the Frankfurt newspaper, of the Feuilleton section, and very, very important. And his essays, from, if we're going to have a set text for the course, I would say his essays from the Feuilleton would be that set text. It's called The Mass Ornament, and it has fantastic little essays about the importance of going to the cinema to see romantic movies, or of what it is to get a salary. This new phenomenon of bourgeois life in the 1930s in the city were always written about in the newspaper by Siegfried Kracauer. But Walter Benjamin wrote mostly about theatre, but not only. He became kind of the I guess in the discipline of culture studies, people think that Walter Benjamin is one of the beginnings of culture studies, because he had a very focused mind, and his attention to curious details of things that he then wrote about and brought them to our consciousness is amazing. For example, he wrote about so many different things. He wrote about Charles Baudelaire, and Charles Baudelaire smoking hashish. That's very interesting. He wrote about, but he wrote about things like, one essay that I read of his not that long ago again is called "On Unpacking My Books." And right, if you've traveled anywhere, as I have recently again, there is a phenomenon where you get home and you unpack your books that you've brought from somewhere, or you've moved house and you unpack your books, and as you're unpacking the books, you like read through them and remind yourself, even the ones you've already read, you look at them again. He wrote about this as a kind of contemporary experience of some, well, a bit romantic, I guess. He's like indulgent, or certainly fascinated in the focus of holding the book in the hand and looking at the words and then remembering back to when you read it and where you were, and really having a care for and a concern of the intellectual project of writing and communicating to someone. And Benjamin could then convey this through his newspaper articles to readers, and people loved this. Or he did radio shows where he talked about things like this. In fact, a lot of his texts for the newspaper started out as radio addresses. So, and he even did a series of radio talks for children, where he talked about children's stories and the importance of kids' books. Like in Germany, they have Lukas die Lokomotivführer. Lucas, the train engine driver, which is a story sequence for kids' books. And he talked about the importance of the values that are portrayed in that book, in those books for kids. How kids are taught a certain set of values through the little stories that they're given in their school books, and how that forms a citizen. And in fact, that's what a newspaper does, and that's what textbooks do at schools. And that's why, I know in school you all had little stories from the life of Ho Chi Minh, or about village life, or whatever, that are just simple little stories, but they also have certain values, like care for the parents, sacrifice for the nation, or whatever. Right? So he did this, and he talked about this in interesting ways in radio shows. And then his other big interest and fascination he wrote powerfully about was the importance of the city, urban studies. And this is where media and the urban really overlap in a big way. I hope later in the course we'll read the work of Scott McGuire from the Urban Studies Reader. I've mentioned it before actually already. And Scott McGuire talks about the importance of the cityscape and the screen in the city, the big screen in cities, and how in some cities big screens are reshaping the central market area or the center square, or especially when there's big events. And we have it in a certain way here in Ho Chi Minh, for example, when we were able to go out in the streets, when people would crowd around the screens of a cafe to watch a football match or something, if Vietnam were playing. And Scott McGuire wrote really interestingly about the Football World Cup when it was in Japan and Korea, because there were big screens in the middle of Seoul where thousands of people came to watch together these events. Anyway, Benjamin's work that gets into this was based on Paris. He is fascinated by Paris. He described it as the capital of the 19th century. And especially in Paris, you can visit these things still today when you can travel, the passages. In between the roads, there are houses, apartment blocks, and between the roads, there are small thoroughfares, passages where you can, pedestrian streets where you can walk through. In Ho Chi Minh City in District 1, there's a couple of these actually. If you go from, I can't remember the name of the street right now. The mall, the street that has the big pedestrian zone, you go from there across to some of the parallel streets. You can cut through a number of shops that are like an arcade. Yeah, an arcade is the word for it. Well, the French had many of these arcades and still do in Paris. They have many arcades. And Benjamin would wander around these arcades and look at all the shops that would put out their commodities. And he'd say, he wrote about this in the Arcades Project as in really fascinating ways, that you could walk around and be what he called a flaneur. You could wander around these arcades and look at, pick up even, contemplate, consider, but not even buy the many commodities of contemporary bourgeois capitalism. And he was quite fascinated by that. Unlike a market or unlike a world fair where you shouldn't really handle the commodities, the idea in these arcades was that they were there to entice you into the shop. So you were supposed to pick them up and look at them. And ideally you would be drawn in, but quite often people didn't draw in. They just wandered around. And it became a thing to do, to just walk up and down the arcades and be seen by others. And he wrote about that in interesting ways. He also was, of course, because he's in the Frankfurt School, a Marxist, and connected with the revolutionary project. He was interested in surrealism and film, and he wrote very movingly and powerfully about film in the Soviet Union. And he visited Russia in the 1920s a couple of times. He had a Russian girlfriend for a while. And towards the end of his life, well, in Paris, he was friends also with some communists, communist surrealists, some radical communists like Georges Bataille, for example, the surrealist, communist, sometimes Trotskyists. That's a bit problematic, but no, anti-Trotskyists too. Anyway, it's his Arcades project we have kept because Bataille was working in the institution of the library, and he hid Benjamin's work. When Benjamin ran for his life across the mountains to Spain, Bataille had taken Benjamin had given Bataille his work, and he hid it inside the library so the Nazis couldn't find it, because they wanted to destroy the work of Jewish intellectuals, right? And the only reason we've got even a version of the manuscript of the Arcades is that Bataille had hidden the drafts inside the library. Benjamin then leaves. Just before he dies, in 1938, he writes an amazing text called Theses on History about violence, and the police have authorized use, a monopoly on the authorized use of violence, and so on. But by 41, he was locked up in a camp, and then managed to get bureaucratic release, and he was waiting in Marseille to try and get a ticket to go to America in Vichy, France, right? Germany had taken over 3/4 of France. And eventually he makes a run for it over the Pyrenees, over the Spanish mountains. But on the day that he got to the border, the Spanish authorities had closed the border. They opened it a couple of days later again, but he was so despondent and so tired from climbing the mountains that he took his own life. He took morphine and killed himself. Apparently, he'd been clutching a suitcase with a manuscript in it, and he said that was the more important than him. That was the thing that had to get to freedom, to America, away from the Nazis, was his manuscript, but that's lost. So he also lost his life, and we lost the text. But Benjamin's essays subsequently became very much cherished and produced in ever more luxurious editions. Now I have a collection of his selected works, which is a very beautiful edition. And some of his essays are central to our discipline of media studies, including this one that we'll read next week. So I will put this on the e-learning, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. And we're going to take turns to read it. In fact, what we might do is now get someone to read just this. No, I want to get someone to read this introductory quote from Paul Valery. But actually, what I want to do first is also listen to someone else who is an old friend of mine. Now he's passed away because he also killed himself, talking about the reproducibility of media and bringing it up to date to contemporary times. So before we get into this, because I'll put this on the e-learning so you can read it and become familiar with it. What I'm going to instead show you is a bit of the talk from this guy, Mark Fisher. And he's also quoting someone at the start of his talk, right? Now, Mark was a member of I employed him within the Center for Culture Studies, as an adjunct for many years, actually. Not on high pay, a part-time job. Unfortunately, we didn't have a full-time job for him. And for a long time, he struggled with part-time jobs, and he also struggled with depression. And he wrote about this in powerful and moving ways. And he also was a music critic and had a blog, and it was very interesting. So I think he's worth listening to. And he wrote about media in ways that are also cool and interesting and informed, enthusiastic, maybe sometimes a little bit off, but you can disagree with him, but always in interesting ways. And here he's talking. He's starting off his talk. He's quoting a guy called Berardi, Franco Berardi, from a recent text, and he'd just played a piece of music, which I'll spare you, Baran, and then starts to talk about um, contemporary times. Now it's from some time back, right? It's from the end of the beginning of the century, but I think well worth listening. So I'm just going to introduce this. I don't know how much we'll listen to, maybe 10 or 15 minutes, and that'll do for today. So we can get into Walter Benjamin next week. But yeah, he's giving this talk, and in Sweden of all places, and yeah, I just won't say much more than that. He's doing a few quotes, and then he talks about the internet culture of, or the mass culture of the 90s. I think I have to turn my microphone off so that I can turn him on. Let me see.
The 9. There, Baradi argues, the acceleration of information exchange has produced and is producing an effect of a pathological type on the individual human mind, and even more on the collective mind. Individuals are not in a position to consciously process the immense and always growing mass of information that enters their computers, their cell phones, their television screens, their electronic diaries, and their heads. However, it seems indispensable to follow, recognize, evaluate, process all this information if you want to be efficient, effective, victorious. The practice of multitasking, the opening of a window of hypertextual attention, the passage from one context to another for the complex evaluation of processes, tends to deform the sequential modality of mental processing. According to Christian Marazzi, who has concerned himself in various books with the relations between economics, language, and affectivity, the latest generation of economic operators is affected by a real and proper form of dyslexia, incapable of reading a page from the beginning to the end, according to sequential procedures, incapable of maintaining concentrated attention on the same object for a long time. And dyslexia spreads to cognitive and social behaviors, leading to rendering the pursuit of linear strategies nearly impossible. And he continues, today's psychopathy reveals itself ever more clearly as a social epidemic, and more precisely a socio-communicational one. If you want to survive, you have to be competitive, and if you want to be competitive, you must be connected, receive and process continuously an immense and growing mass of data. This provokes a constant attentive stress, a reduction of the time available for affectivity. These two tendencies, inseparably linked, provoke an effect of devastation on the individual psyche. Depression, panic, anxiety, the sense of solitude and existential misery. But these individual symptoms cannot be indefinitely isolated, as psychopathology has done up until now, and as economic power wishes to do. It's not possible to say, you're exhausted, go and take a vacation at Club Med, take a pill, make a cure, get the hell away from it all, recover in the psychiatric hospital, kill yourself. It's no longer possible for the simple reason that it's no longer a matter of a small minority of crazies or a marginal amount of depressives. It concerns a growing mass of existential misery that is tending more to explode in the center of the social system. Okay, and third epigraph then from this recent book by the cyber theorist, the psychoanalytically trained cyber theorist, Sherry Turkle. These days, she writes, being connected depends not on our distance from each other, but from available communications technology. Most of the time we carry that technology with us. In fact, being alone can start to seem like a precondition for being together, because it's easier to communicate if you can focus without interruption on your screen. In this new regime, a train station, like an airport, a cafe or a park, is no longer a communal space, but a place of social collection. People come together but do not speak to each other. Each is tethered to a mobile device and to the people and places which that device serves as a portal. A place used to comprise a physical space and the people within it. What is a place if those who are physically present have their attention on the absent? At a cafe a block from my home, almost everyone is on a computer or smartphone as they drink their coffee. These people are not my friends, yet somehow I miss their presence. Okay, I'm sure that we can all recognize that phenomenon that Turkel describes there. In fact, something that we increasingly take for granted. But I think I want to suggest that those three things that we just heard are profoundly connected. Burial, when I first heard the Burial record in 2006, and I thought it was one of the most important records of the decade, and I retain that belief. I think it's one of the most important cultural statements really to come out of the UK in the first decade of the 21st century, really. Really, that first album, the self-titled album, Burial, and the second one, Untitled, form a kind of single piece in lots of ways. And a kind of affective portrait of what it was like to live in the UK in the early part of the 21st century. And you probably noticed there that in Burial's sound, the relation to dance music, the relation to the UK dance music of the 90s. And one way into this notion of hauntology is to the hearing double that one is required to do when you're confronted with tracks by Burial. What I mean by hearing double is it's a bit like walking into a building, a dilapidated or derelict building, and remembering what that building once looked like. And that's not an idle metaphor in connection with Burial, whose music is sort of full of music concrete type samples which suggest spaces and derelicted or dilapidated spaces. Of course, in Burial's case, what's significant about these spaces is that they were the sites of collective delirium. What we're hearing double the spectral traces of the other music that we're hearing alongside its kind of dilapidated form, is the music inspired by the UK rave scene, really.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
this word dilapidate, what does it mean?
Oh, fallen into disrepair or ruin. Yeah. Yeah, please, and anybody, any point, you can ask me anything. It's the only way we're going to get through this. So yeah, if I say something you just don't understand, or if you just want to ask me anything, any point, that's what I'm used to. I started off teaching like 16 to 19-year-olds, and
So he talks about asking questions. Anyone can ask me questions, which is part of the reason why I was saying you could ask me questions. And he goes on a bit. But maybe we'll skip forward a little bit and continue.
jungle drum bass, and garage. What's significant really about the decade we've just lived through in terms of UK music and UK dance music in particular is the massive slowing down in the rate of change or innovation that has occurred. And this is perhaps one of the first sort of antinomies or paradoxes I want to point to. It's one that actually Frederick Jameson had noted really quite a long time ago in the 80s and early 90s, and the longer the time goes on, the more prophetic I feel that Frederick Jameson's work is actually for noting these trends long before they were clear to the rest of us. Well, that particular paradox is that, okay, particularly in the last 10 years, we've lived through massive changes in culture at a formal level, or certainly the level of the distribution and consumption of culture. Really changes that are unimaginable, actually, almost, from the perspective of the late 90s. You know, bear in mind that, you know, the iPod only really took off in 2005. You know, that's, you know, that seems like a massive threshold, doesn't it? That seems like such that we can barely believe it's only 5 or 6 years ago that happened. So, you know, with the emergence of MP3s, peer-to-peer, etc., the end of CDs, or the virtual end of CDs. Of course, old people still buy them, but it's impossible to imagine, isn't it, really, in 10 years' time, young people buying recorded music, paying for recorded music. That's already kind of totally anachronistic to lots of young teenagers or people younger than that, you know, who don't even have MP3s now. They're more likely, if they listen to music, to get it via YouTube or such like. But okay, so we can, when we take a step back, we can all think, okay, that's a massive change in consumption and distribution of music that's happened over the last 10 years. Yet, at a cultural level, at the level of content of culture, rather than the sort of form in which we consume it, there's a massive deceleration. That, you know, the example I mentioned of UK dance music, where, you know, forms of music would emerge in the 90s that were sonically unimaginable only a short time before. Something like jungle drum and bass. You couldn't have conceived of anything like, and you know, even a year or two before it actually emerged, you couldn't have conceived of anything like that. So when it actually emerged, it was a sudden eruption and a rush of the future coming in. And there was a whole succession of these developments in the 90s. You struggle to find anything of that sort in the 21st century. Now, the mainstream, one could say, that mainstream popular music or whatever had been slowing down for some time, perhaps. It's possible to ignore that. You know, well, for instance, in the UK, we had the miserable spectacle of things like Britpop in the 90s. You know, the pathetic kind of attempt to pretend it was the 60s again and all of that, and the return of...
Okay, I've stopped in there because he started to talk about Britpop, and maybe I should explain Britpop and how narrow a focus he has here on what's going on in England, right? Love him as I do. There's a sense in which, okay, Britpop was pretty bad. I agree with him there completely, but it was very much confined just to that little island off the coast of England, right? Bands like Oasis and Blur and Pulp and so on. And they were really a kind of white European block against American music, hip-hop, especially black American music. And to think that was the last confrontation, the drum and bass and jungle and so on were examples of this, the last confrontation between hegemonic music industry and its American exploitation of rap and so on, is one version of the history of popular music that we talk about in different courses that I teach. But it's a phenomenon that's interesting, that here his music journalism is expressing something from a debate in media studies that's still unresolved, and it's the question of the speed question in content, right? So he talks about a deceleration. We got acceleration and deceleration. An acceleration in the forms in which we consume media, so that we've got more and more accessible devices, and more things are on this device, and the media is more and more connected, and that somehow is speeding up. And this is a big question. Like, do you feel like there is more media, more things to consume? And what's your psychic reaction to that? Does it paralyze you? And then in terms of content, he says, but it's all somehow the same. There's not really significant change. That implies that in the 90s there really was big changes. But I wonder, because, Adorno would say, but, all these things that say that they are so different only say they are different. They are saying exactly the same thing. Look at us, we're different. And they still fit into the CD or into the MP3 or into the commodity form which is being sold to people. And of course, the wider context of this media discussion about whether there is too much content or too much information or too much new media or too fast, overwhelming sense of the media flowing over us, that we can't analyze it anymore. We can't have a theory about it anymore. We can't grasp it. Happens at the very same time when global capitalism, the commodity culture that's dominates the world, in most places is not moving much at all, is in slump, is in stagnation. I mean, very few countries have any kind of economic growth. Vietnam is one of them, China. But most countries have been in 10 years at least of economic depression, of stagnation and slump, which means no movement at all. And in this period where there's been this ideology of internet and content and speed of information flow, and so many more emails are coming and so on, there's actually very little movement in productivity and in profit taking for capital. In fact, the capitalist corporations are desperately trying to scrape small amounts of fees and commissions from what is the stagnant economy, right? So they're trying to privatize the national health services, and introducing fees for doing COVID tests or whatever, making or trying to create fake money-making opportunities like arms sales to Afghanistan in a war that will never end, or if it ends, it ends in defeat with nothing having changed at all. Which is interesting. So on the one hand, the media theorists are saying there's too much information and so much speed and information and content and so on. On the other hand, there's global stagnation and no movement at all. And this is a dialectic of media studies that we need someone like Walter Benjamin to help us cut through. Right? Which is why I'm going to be asking you to be reading that next week. Right? So, all right, a lot of that will be too much and too fast, but you can always look at it again. I will put the link to the Mark Fisher talk, the longer talk, and you can go back and listen to the piece of music he is talking about. I'll put that on the e-learning, like straight away. And the videos from today will be available. I should stop recording. And lots more to read as well. The essay from Walter Benjamin will be there to read. And as I said, we'll spend next week going through it, like, seriously, reading deeply, reading carefully, reading slowly, because it's a speed question as well. How much you understand, how much I understand, depends on how fast and how deeply I go into a text. And in fact, that's an important research skill that I want to convey to you, that reading is a skill that requires deep attention and a slow speed of comprehension. You don't understand more because you read more. You maybe understand more because you spend longer on a sentence than you did on a whole book. And this will give us an opening into the media. Because, you know, if you read just one image, you read it well, you can be reading the whole of media theory. That's the weird dialectic about the mass media, because it's so massified that one image can say it all. That's such a silly point that I'm going to just have to stop with that one. It's so absurdly philosophical or something. I'll stop the recording. 3 stops to stop it.